A very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this iconic company presentation. I am Mahesh Rajan, professor and faculty director of executive programs at San Jose State University in the Lucas College and Graduate School of Business. It gives me great pleasure today to invite Mr. Nitin Rakesh, the CEO of Emphasis, to share some of his thoughts and insights with us all, particularly about transformation in times of crisis. I'm sure you all looked at Nitin's impressive bio, his credentials, as well as relevant details. Nitin has also co authored a highly acclaimed book with Professor Jerry Wind of the Wharton School of Business. And the talk today will center around the main principles that Nitin and Professor Wind have provided for us, right? And Nitin has kindly agreed to take questions throughout his talk. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and or in the live Q&A icon, and I will present them to Nitin as and when appropriate, right? So without further ado, I want to turn the floor over to Nitin. Nitin, thank you so much for agreeing to share some of your insights with us. And my first question to you is, how did you arrive at this particular, topic, this particular book, and what are some of the sort of key, propositions that you're going to talk about later?
Good morning, Mahesh, and good morning, good evening to everybody around the world who are locked on. Firstly, thank you for having me and for the kind words that you used in your introduction. I'm actually quite passionate about the topic of disruption, and I think disruption, innovation, and transformation are themes, but they all cut from the same cloth. So about 3 years ago, we were doing one of these sessions at the Wharton School that Jerry was actually moderating, and the topic of the discussion with many of Emphasis customers in the room, the topic was all around disruption and how disruption was effectively coming to impact almost every company in every industry. And unlike the olden days where most of your competitors came from within the industry, we were starting to see, I would say, a very different pattern. One, the pace of change was quickening, and two, it was getting pretty evident that a lot of the disruption was actually coming from outside of the traditional industry competitors, whether it was fintech, whether it was insurance, whether it was retail. So I think it warranted a little bit of a deeper thought and construct, and we designed that session and the workshop to really be what we used to call the architecture of disruption, which is how do you deal with this disruption as a business, as an enterprise, given that it was kind of being fairly broadly felt across multiple industries in almost every part of the world. And the common theme was technology seems to be leading the disruption. So we had to kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive to see whether it was tech-led disruption or something else. And we started looking back and we started looking at some data points, and it was getting pretty clear that the pace of change was getting faster.
Sure.
If you look at if you look at some data points that I will share with you, if you just look at, if you move to the next slide,
Yeah, to the next slide, the EPEC.
yeah, if you look at the pace of change, this is a chart that talks about how much time it took for innovations to get to 50 million users across the last 100 years. And if you look at telephone, automobiles, even television, they were all, in measured in years. And if you look at the last innovation or the last update that you have seen on this chart, that's the COVID app, that was launched in India March of 2020 or April of 2020. And you can see it has actually shrunk. Before that, it used to be Pokemon Go, that used to be measured in days, and even that has actually shrunk further, down from 19 days to 12 or 13 days. This is just data, and sometimes when you take a long view, you can see what impact we are having on a daily basis. We're just so close to it that on a day-to-day basis we don't realize the impact. There is a direct correlation between what you see on this page and what you will see on the next page.
Next page, yeah.
The next one. This is the average tenure of companies in the S&P 500, which basically means that the longevity of businesses in the leadership positions has actually halved in the last 60, 70 years from what it used to be in the 50s, 60s to what it is today. And I think this will actually surprise us further. My sense is it'll probably end up being 10 to 12 years by the time we get to 2030. And just another data point that you don't see on this chart, but I will verbalize it for you. More than 50% of companies that were in the Fortune 500 list at the turn of century, 21 years ago in 2000, are no longer either present as independent companies or have gone bankrupt.
Wow.
50%, more than 50% in 20 years, right? So this is just data points that should give you a pause, especially if you're a business exec, if you work in a company and an enterprise that has been around for 20, 25 years, or as we call it, the pre-internet age. If companies were founded before 95 or after 95, big impact, big difference in the way they're architected their business models. And this kind of really led us to start digging deeper into this topic of disruption. And we effectively came to a conclusion that disruption is not led by technology. And I think it seems a little counterintuitive. Technology has an important role to play, but disruption is not led by technology. Disruption is actually led by consumers, because consumers and their expectations have moved dramatically as they have been exposed to multiple new businesses that have emerged in the last 20 years, in the digital age, whether it is Amazon, Facebook, Google, Apple, Netflix. They are shaping the customer experience and the consumer expectation in every industry, in every business, in every part of the world. And hence, that loyalty that customer had to brands and products is become a little bit different, and the loyalty is now to customer, is not only to brands but to customer experiences. And that's really what's driving the bigger part of the disruption. So we were actually deep into this topic of of understanding the impact the customer expectation was having, and how enterprises should actually think about changing their business model to become a lot more consumer centric, a lot less rigid and monolithic in their thinking when it comes to back office operations and processes. And how do you embrace all the change that was around us, especially the change that was very evident post the massive adoption of smartphones, and every business becoming a digital business and every business having a big consumer element to it. So with that in mind, we started writing, about disruption. Jerry and I partnered to write a book. The topic of the book was actually called Architecture of Disruption, and we were, I would say, quite further along in our thinking, in our construct of the principles that we thought would be important. And then, of course, 18, 9, 20 months ago, the world changed on us pretty much overnight with the emergence of a global pandemic. And we took a pause because we wanted to see what was going on. It became pretty evident very quickly within I would say 2 to 3 weeks of the pandemic, that we had seen a further quickening and an acceleration of the same trends that we were talking about in the book. Uh, every business became a digital business, even the ones that were unexpected to. Education, uh, you know, telemedicine, e-commerce exploded. Uh, Almost everybody was, the only way they could interact with their customers and stakeholders was through digital channels. Restaurant chains started to succeed if they had a digital strategy, and fail if they didn't have a digital strategy. So it was pretty evident that we were living through some very seminal moment. And I think the quote that comes to mind to describe what happened in March to June of 2020, sometimes nothing happens for decades, and sometimes decade happen for week. It happens in days. So we kind of went through in a few days the acceleration that we would have seen, in a few years. And hence we decided that this is exactly what we were talking about in our disruption uh, you know, uh, uh, theme architecture. And we pivoted the book to actually talk a lot more about how do you use this pandemic driven crisis as an opportunity to actually transform and accelerate the change of your own business. So from that context, that's the backstory of the book, Mahesh. That's how we ended up writing a lot about transformation and change, and how we could use the crisis to embrace change quicker and go faster. But effectively, the principles of transformation that we've outlined in the book, are fairly, in our view, fairly consistent, can be applied almost to any crisis, anytime, and in terms of fast forwarding the transformation.
Sure, great, Nitin. So the implications are quite clear. Disruption is here to stay, and no company can take the status quo for granted, right? anybody can come in and change the games of the rule completely, right? So let's get to the heart of your book, which are the 8 principles. So Epek, if you could move to the next slide, and we'll talk about each of these principles, and maybe you can provide some examples as well, right? So the first principle is basically about challenging and changing mental models, right? Could you give an example to explain how this is relevant for business leaders?
I think we basically we've constructed these 8 principles as a guidepost or a set of principles that can be used to effectively test and apply a hypothesis in your own businesses, in your own lives. In fact, whether it is a business, it's a not-for-profit, you could even take it from as a guidepost to your own career transformation. And I think the first principle is what we call very foundational, because the very first instinct uh, you know businesses have, executives have, is if everything's working fine, we're a successful company, I'm successful in what I do, why do I need to change anything? And of course, change creeps up on you, and it goes exponentially, as we've seen in the last 12, 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
So it is very hard to actually apply change unless you embrace the fact that you need to actually do that. And that's why the mental model shift starts at the top, definitely at the top of the company's C suite. But effectively, it's about accepting that status quo is not the answer. You can't expect the pandemic to get over and for us to get back to life pre 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Businesses have changed forever, consumers have changed forever, employees have changed forever, remote interactions are here to stay. Digital channel is now the primary channel of interaction. You could have an omni-channel construct, but it'll always be digital first, and in many cases, digital only. So I think this very strong urge to go back to pre-crisis, to go back to how things were, and to expect that nothing will impact the age-old businesses, I think is a fallacy that we are basically trying to address in this mental model shift. And time after time, we've seen examples of companies that have actually succeeded, through such changes. Let me give you 2 examples. If you look at a company like Walmart, very strong physical footprint across North America, very successful company, was the top of the list in terms of market cap for a number of years. Of course, is no longer in the top 5, but still very, very prominent business. I think they embrace this construct of of being consumer centric, of providing additional channels, and truly embracing this digital transformation, and went out all out and acquired Jet.com and effectively reverse merged their entire digital e-commerce strategy through Jet. And effectively, they've ended up building a very, very strong omni-channel footprint, and now are integrated end to end in their e-commerce systems. And that was a shift for their leadership. They could have very easily gone the Sears route, where they really didn't have a digital strategy, but they decided that it was too critical and too risky for them actually not to shift their thinking and apply this mental model shift. Another example of a very successful mental model shift application is Microsoft. Just in the last 6 or 7 years, they obviously went from being a desktop software company to actually being a digital first business in the way they've embraced all things around as a service, cloud, and open source. If somebody had come to us and told us 7 years ago that Microsoft's going to be the champion for open source because they actually went and embraced and bought the biggest open source registry in the world, we wouldn't have believed that in 2010, 11, 12.
Sure.
Right? So those are 2 good examples of leadership applying mental model shifts and actually transforming their companies to be super successful despite the digital disruption all around them.
That's right. And given the new normal, digital seems to be the primary channel that companies connect with their customers, right? And speaking about Walmart, it's not just the acquisition of Jet.com, but in India, they also acquired Flipkart,
Flipkart.
right? So they want a global, sort of a presence in the digital, this thing, right? So now, how do we reimagine and reinvent ourselves to connect with our customers and our stakeholders? You touched upon it in the previous point, but maybe you can expand on it further.
Yeah, I think let me take 2 and 3 together because I
Mhm.
think they are in a way kind of intertwined. Just like all these principles are intertwined, while you can start with any, but all of them are intertwined. But 2 and 3 specifically are intertwined because let's talk about reimagining and reinventing your approach to customers, and then talk about how do you actually use that understanding of that customer to drive personalization at scale.
Sure.
Uh, I think the very first question every business is asking and must ask if they're not asking is how well do you know your consumer? If you think of businesses like Netflix or Amazon, the strength that they derive from their business model starts with the fact that they understand the customer expectations and needs really well. Netflix at heart is nothing but a matching engine between content and consumers,
That's right.
right? And that's what their entire model was built on. They didn't make content 10 years ago when they started in the digital world. I mean, they were actually renting DVDs, right? But for them to actually move and create this intermediary intelligent system that could match content with consumers was really their unique positioning. And they got to understand their customers so well that they then started making content. And for every dollar they put in content, their chances of success are at least 3 to 4x higher than the chances of success that a traditional studio had in making content. Why?
Hmm.
Because they actually understood their consumer really well, and they used data to derive that knowledge of consumer. Apply the same thinking to a traditional company, a bank, an insurance company, and a retailer. How well do you know your customer? Right? It's not just about having data. It's also about understanding how do you use the data to derive the understanding about that customer, and then how do you customize their experiences, as they deal with you. Uh, you know, for example, a bank, should the bank not know exactly who you are based on the payroll account, checking account, consumer loan, mortgage, credit card, all of the information that sits in the banking system? And if yes, should they not be able to actually perceive the needs of every consumer and actually customize their approach to that customer instead of actually doing mass marketing, even if they're doing it digitally? Just
Sure.
because an email campaign goes on doesn't make it a digital marketing campaign. It's actually sent digitally, but it's still a mass marketing campaign. Right? So I think customer loyalty is now shifting to experiences primarily because they would like businesses to actually understand who they are, what their needs are, customize those needs, and then interact with the customer. We all thought when Amazon Prime was launched that it's the premier free shipping model, and Amazon is doing it to actually expand their wallet share. All of that is true. However, Amazon Prime is the largest example worldwide of a hyper personalized engine where they want to understand each consumer's needs,
Hmm.
down to the point that actually they can start making product recommendations through their marketplace because they understand who you are based on the patterns they see in your Prime account, right? So then they applied that same Prime thinking to music, to media content, to pretty much everything they do today in dealing with every consumer that sits on Amazon Prime. So I think the way to think about customer journey mapping, the way to think about running your business is customer first, and that's what we talk about in principles 2 and 3. And again, there are some really great examples of how businesses and companies are actually employing some of those techniques and tactics. Whether they happen to be the new age companies, or we are now starting to see the same thinking being applied in even industries like insurance, where you should be paying for insurance based on your personal characteristics of risk, whether
That's right.
how fast you drive the car, average speed, average number of sharp turns, uh, and all of that data should actually be used to personalize the insurance premium based on your pattern. And just an example of how that information is today being used for personalization and putting customer in the middle.
That's right. I mean, so personalization and customization are the keys to success in today's world, and customers expect this kind of unique marketing offers, right? So let's build on that and move to the next principle. What about the importance of speed and bringing about change?
Yeah, I think just go back to the discussion we had around the shifting timescales and the
Mhm.
exponential decline we've seen in the pace of innovation. I think agility and customer centricity are the number one and number two asks that every business exec has, from their companies, and every customer has from the businesses they're interacting with. Agility, adjacency, and adaptability are kind of the three core principles that we've talked about. Good examples, as you think about understanding the customer better, as you understand their needs better, can you cross sell? Can you move into areas that are adjacent? Can you get a higher share of wallet? And I think we've talked about examples like a company like Charles Schwab started as a discount brokerage, then of course started moving into the advice space, then started automating the advice using robo advice 2016 2017 onwards, and has constantly kept up with almost every challenger that has come into their domain. From almost any part of the any part of the financial services market, because they've kept their focus on the end consumer. And similar examples, with other industries and other companies too. But that's a great example of how they've moved, adapted at speed, and kept all the fintechs away, and are still happen to be one of the largest broker dealers in the country, despite rapid emergence of players like Robinhood. So I think adaptability, agility, adjacency, uh, again go back to understanding of the consumer, and hence I talked about the fact that these principles are quite intertwined with each other.
Sure. In most successful companies, it's not just market share anymore, it's the share of wallet, as you correctly mentioned, right? So let's talk about innovation, experimentation.
Yeah, I think again most successful companies have to create a model where they're able to create innovation as part of their business DNA. And innovation isn't just about what do I need to do today, how can I be more innovative with my customer today. It's also about doing it across in horizons. There are techniques of experimentation, and we talked about adaptive experimentation, that basically lets you fail fast and use data to determine which initiatives you should fund, which you shouldn't fund. But I think the basic theme of innovation across horizons is you should be ready to, you should have the ability to innovate across what may seem important today, but also what may seem important a year from now or 2 years from now, because you'll never be able to predict how fast that change will come. Sometimes, as I mentioned, right, nothing happens for decades, and then sometimes decades happen in days. If you look at e-commerce, what happened in 10, 15 years actually happened in 2 weeks within the crisis. So if you didn't have enough initiatives underway, again we talked about Walmart, we talk about FedEx, we talk about many companies that had to actually invest, but they had to invest ahead of the curve, not at the time of the need. I think that's what we talk about, creating an innovation mindset and using adaptive experimentation to innovate across uh, horizons. I'll give you another example of something like blockchain has been around for a very long time, and we're now starting to see it start disrupting multiple industries. Anything that is trust based, crypto is a whole different implementation of blockchain. Digital currencies is a good one, and now we're starting to see things like NFTs. What impact will that have on the traditional lending and trust based services? That's starting to happen today. Similarly, there's something like quantum computing, which of course Emphasis has a very strong footprint in, and we're making a big bet on it, as are some other companies. However, it seemed like it was a 5 year investment horizon. Suddenly we are seeing real live examples of quantum being used in 2021 itself. When we made the investment in 2020, it seemed like it was a 3 to 5 year bet, but it actually ended up being immediate application of those, especially in areas like cybersecurity and optimization, drug discovery. And I think again, COVID has actually accelerated many of those trends. But that's the power of actually having innovation horizons and investments made across those horizons.
Sure. And from my experience, Nitin, most companies, even though they talk about innovation, they engage in mostly incremental innovation because it's quite, resource intensive, as well as the risks of failure are very high. So how do you change organizational cultures, the incentive structures, managerial mindsets to think outside the box and, to maybe push the limits in terms of new ideas, new products, new services, new processes?
Yeah, I think, Mahesh, again, for some companies that were born in the current era, it comes naturally to them because that was their business model. I think the whole moonshot factory at Google X, I mean, it is a business model. They're making big bets because they think some of them can actually become really big. But if you look at traditional businesses that have been around for longer than the internet has been around, they've actually had to make a specific effort, conscious effort at actually using techniques like idealized design or changing the org design and org structure to have, it's not about having a skunk works group that only focuses on R&D. It's actually about creating that adaptive experimentation mindset across the firm, making it part of the culture and the DNA. And that's where I think the whole mental model shift at the top really helps. I think we gave examples of Walmart and
Sure.
Microsoft, and
Mhm.
and I think even firms as innovative as NASA have actually applied a lot of those techniques because they have to stay relevant in their businesses. So I think it's a combination. Org design. Every business has to think about themselves being part of a network. I think that's the whole orchestration thinking. You're part of an ecosystem. You can actually use things like open innovation and open talent. We've talked about
Sure.
that in the book as well.
Hmm.
At Emphasis, we actually practice those with open talent mindset. We have a startup engagement model that brings innovation from the incubators in the startup community. We actually take that to our customers and effectively industrialize that whole open innovation, thinking in a structured process. So I think it's a combination of many things that we need to do. But the very first thing again will be the whole shift in the way you want to think about it and the mental model that you use to think about your business architecture.
That's right. And it looks like there's a paradigm shift where in the past, companies used to try to keep everything in-house, but now they're exploring, open source and partnering with other players in the ecosystem, right? Now let's go to the next principle, which is about redrawing your timelines and building a portfolio of
Yeah, I think we
initiatives.
talked about, yeah, I talked about that a little bit about, across multiple innovation horizons. So I think from that perspective, this is a principle that really does talk about, how do you think about horizons that maybe seem a little bit longer term, and keeping in mind that they're dynamic, not static, right? What seemed like a longer term bet will become immediate very quickly, because I have a belief that, all of us, again in day to day business, we overestimate the impact of tech in the short run, but underestimate the impact of tech in the long run. Which means unless we actually create these, investments in innovation across multiple horizons, we will never get the timing right.
That's right. Okay, great. And then the last
Maybe we
point.
can take a few questions, Mahesh. I know we have about 15, 18 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm waiting. I want to encourage the students and the participants to send me your questions, and I can ask Nitin or forward those questions. But maybe we'll talk about the last point,
Sure.
Nitin, and then let's see if people post any questions.
In terms of the whole idealized design network orchestration, I think again, as I mentioned, right, every business is part of an ecosystem. Some of the most successful innovations in the last 8 to 10 years have come from companies that have exploited this network design. I think of Uber. Right? It's really a network business with a very powerful concept of connecting everybody in the network to a common app and using the intelligence in the phone and the location to actually build a business model around it. And I think that's harder to do for established businesses. But think of a company like FedEx that is actually a logistics network,
Hmm.
and they've actually talked about moving away from being a company that moves packages from point A to point B to being a company that actually becomes a hub for logistics and a network platform. And that platform thinking is something that I would encourage almost every business to apply. Right? How can you create a platform, whether it happens to be data driven, it happens to be, in case of FedEx, there is a lot of logistics information. They should be best placed to tell you how that flow of information is going to impact your decisions around inventory, fulfillment, and hence become the backbone for e-commerce. I think that's a big shift for them from a company that was optimized to deliver packages at the fastest pace. Of course, the information about the package is as important, if not more important, than the package itself. And they've been saying that since 1978. But it's still a paradigm shift for them to actually think of themselves as a logistics platform.
Sure.
Right? And
So
that will only come if they start thinking of themselves as part of a network or actually become the network for logistics. Of course, in many cases there will be more than one who will compete for that. But I think that to me is a massive pivot and a business model shift that almost every industry and every company is trying to do. I mean, open banking in the UK is about taking banks away from actually becoming checking and savings accounts to actually becoming payment platforms or open platforms that people can use the bank for last mile or they can use the bank for the entire transaction. Right?
mhm.
That that's what banks are being forced to think like, because there are multiple value chains that are getting disrupted within the whole banking ecosystem. Right? Payments was a good example. Right? From merchant onboarding all the way to P2P payments, all of that used to happen through banks earlier. All of that can happen outside of the banks today, right? With Venmo and a lot of the peer-to-peer applications on lending that enable that to happen. And banks only come into the picture because of the final step of money movement, from your Venmo account to your bank account.
That's right.
Everything else happens outside of the bank, right?
That's
So
right.
that's kind of the way we think about deploying, the network thinking, and using some principles like org architecture or design. Think about how you can be part of that ecosystem.
That's right. So take a much more holistic and comprehensive perspective rather than focus on the actual service being provided. Right. Fantastic, Nitin. I have a few questions from our students, so let me read them out to you. The first question is from Aditi Pandey. She's a student at the Lucas College of Business, and she says, "My question is, how can the employees at the granular level bring up their innovative ideas to top management without being quashed in the process?" Right.
Yeah, I think most companies have had this challenge where I think empowerment and the ability to impact and change seem limited, and I think some of that has changed. Some of that will continue to change. Most innovative companies or companies that want to embrace change have started to create initiatives around hackathons and crowdsourcing of ideas. I think that to me is a very welcome change. There are initiatives that can be run that again, change doesn't have to happen in the CEO's office alone. You're part of a group. You work in one department in the company. You can actually start with change there itself. I would actually even argue that change will first have to start with you as an exec, as an employee, and then you can actually start impacting a slightly broader group of people as well. So I think no easy answer. Yes, companies are structured to be hierarchical because that's the org design. But as you embrace some of these principles, and as you start embracing a little bit more agility and openness to innovation, we're starting to see that in many companies already. And some of the examples I gave you are companies that have actually made that shift and continue to be very, very aware of having to make a lot more changes to the way they're organized.
That's right. And it's not just the internal drivers, but they're also facing intense competition from competitors, in the marketplace. The next question is from my colleague from Peru, Armando Borda. He says, "What is your advice for companies headquartered in countries where the ecosystem is not supported to innovate?"
Um, I think I'm actually going to challenge you because, yeah, I understand, every country has a different ecosystem, especially with regulations and governance, but innovation actually seems needs no bounds. It will find a way to make change happen. Sometimes regulations will keep up with it, sometimes they will lag. If you look at countries like India and China, I mean, India is a great example where there is a lot of ecosystem deficiencies, whether it's infrastructure driven, whether it's on virtual connectivity. But we've seen companies find ways around it. They've either found ways technically or they found business model changes that help them adapt. And it's actually a vibrant hub now for innovation around a lot of these constraints. So I think it is a constraint, but it's only a constraint if you let it be. There are ways to work around some of these inconsistencies and deficiencies, and again, that's all very much part of the innovation. And how do you localize it? How do you use the local ecosystem? And in many cases, actually, that creates more opportunities as well, because it's not always the big global players who actually succeed because they don't understand that market. I think Mahesh talked about Walmart going in and acquiring Flipkart, because Flipkart had actually been very successful at creating a local e-commerce ecosystem, something that even a company as large as Walmart found very attractive. Right? Not that they couldn't have done it, but it would have taken them a lot longer to do it. So I think it's a lot to do with localizing innovation and understanding the local context, and using those constraints to your advantage as well.
Sure, it might be harder in some countries or contexts, but do you see the glass as half full or half empty? Right. Now let's go to the next question. This is from William Cortez. William, I'm not sure which school you represent, but William's question is: in transnational OEM companies, the development areas are only in the parent company. Do you think it's necessary to decentralize this department to market areas around the world in order to create innovations?
Again, I think Walmart was a great example, right? They had to find a way to innovate locally, and hence they decided. I mean, this was in a number of ways an acknowledgement of the fact that the headquarters in Bentonville couldn't really innovate for India. I think we're seeing a lot of that happen with many other multinational companies. I have personal experience of seeing many of those companies operating in different markets: India, China, Middle East. We've seen many of those localized innovation hubs being built. Uh, I think the first task always is for the HQ to recognize and realize And in many cases, I've actually seen local initiatives being taken at the local country level or a region level, and many times, they're presented back to HQ with very specific data and outcomes. And I think I would encourage you to if you work for a country or a region that belongs to a global multinational corp, I think I would very highly encourage you to think about local innovation. I think I'll give you examples of a company like BAT, very very local, empowerment to regions to innovate. Whether it's Reynolds in the US, whether it's ITC in India, I mean, we've seen that impact. Unilever is another great example. While they're a global company, they actually build products for local markets because
That's
the
right.
local markets have very distinct needs and flavors. So I think there is almost always a think global, act local mindset. I mean, that's a phrase I learned in business school, 27 years ago, and it's still very much very valid and relevant, but applied to innovation as well. So I think very good point, but absolutely relevant even in the current context.
That's right, Nitin. And some progressive companies actually are taking advantage of innovation in their local operations, and it's called reverse innovation, as you may know, which Vijay Govindarajan and Jeff Immel talked about, and bring it back to the corporate headquarters and then spread it throughout the global operations. Right?
Yeah,
Fantastic.
absolutely. GE has done a lot of that reverse innovation.
That's
In
right.
fact,
Yeah.
we have actually embraced something called reverse mentoring, which is kind of an extension of that, because it's the shape of the pyramid in an org design. Sometimes needs to be turned on its head, because the millennial and the Gen Z population probably has a better chance of mentoring some of the senior leadership on what the Gen Z trends are. So I think it's a similar construct of reverse innovation applied to leadership development that we are also experimenting with.
Yeah, that's fantastic because leadership and sort of ability to mentor can be present anywhere, not just in the corporate headquarters. Right. Any other questions from the? Oh, okay. 1 minute. Let me switch to the presenters chat. Jose, what is your question?
Yeah, I think the question was, how do I own my experience running emphasis, support or contradict the lessons from the study and transformation? It's a great question, Jose, because I think it's not just about do as I say, but I think I have to do as I say as well. Many constructs that we've talked about in the book are actually formed based on the personal experience of running the company. And then a little bit of context on emphasis. I think a great Gen 1 company founded by founders who came out of the banking system in the late 90s, with a very strong focus on bringing techno functional innovation to the way the banks were operating in their technology and operations areas. We did really well, very successful company, and we spent 10 years under a big brand IT. We were owned by EDS and HP for many years. And as we were, spinning out in 2016, we had the opportunity to actually reset the landscape and choose where we want to play, how we want to go to market, what kind of businesses we want to, represent, and what would be our biggest, so to speak, calling card when we call enterprises that we do services on behalf of. So we are a tech services company, right? So in a way, we are a reflection of enterprise technology buying behavior. So we made many bets across many horizons. First bet we made was businesses will need to actually embrace agility and customer centricity, not very different from what I talked about in the book. Second big bet we made was enterprises will have to change their business architecture, not being run by their back office and their processes and their controls, but being run backwards, from what the customer wants. So in a way, we called it front to back transformation. How can we help enterprises apply that front to back using tech? And the third big bet we made was, how can we accelerate this transformation, for the customers that we work for, especially in the enterprise Fortune 500 world. So, and we built out a whole series of investment initiatives. We made investments in tech, in architecture and design, skills. Design thinking became the primary way for us to create these in these innovation workshops. We started using open talent, open innovation to crowdsource ideas from within the client accounts, and effectively, we are today operating. And the reason why we actually saw a massive acceleration in our own business growth over the last 18 months was because of these investments that were made, pre crisis. And as the crisis hit, we were not only at the right time at the right place, but we also have the right skills and the right tools that were built up over the last 2 or 3 years in actually helping enterprises embrace and adopt those. So Emphasis has actually seen a massive transformation underway in the last 2 or 3 years, and that got accelerated in the last 18 months since the crisis happened, to a point that our growth is now almost 3x of what it was in our core business pre-crisis. Right, so I'm very very happy and proud to have actually you know witnessed this acceleration in the business, applying the many of the same principles we've talked about in the book as well.
Yeah, I was just going to mention you're actually practicing what you have preached in your book, right? And fantastic to hear that the emphasis has grown 3x in the last 18 months. This question is from a student called Daniel Longo. He or she wants to know, with regards to business models, which book can you suggest?
Uh, I think depends on many things. What are you looking for? If you're looking for a discussion on disruption or a shift in the business, I mean there are like so many good books. I can tell you what I've been reading lately, because that's something that I've been very uh, you know uh, personally very impressed by the ability for some of these startups to scale very rapidly. So I've been reading a book called Blitzscaling, that's written by Reid Hoffman, and it talks about the choices you have to make. Talk great examples of Airbnb and Uber, and many companies that have actually had to make these choices as they scaled. And again, it depends on the context you're looking for, but
Sure.
there's a whole list of books that we can talk through.
Yeah.
I've also been, Give and Take. Give and Take is another favorite book of mine, because it actually aligns organizations together because of the construct that Adam Grant's talked about in there. So I wish I had more time to read many more of these.
Okay, great. Any last parting words for our future business leaders, Nitin?
Again, Mahesh, I'm going to just summarize by saying, many times it looks like our ability to make a change, being in mid management or regional management, is limited. I would actually ask you to challenge that notion. I think change can start at an atomic unit, and can go upwards, sideways, forwards, backwards. It really depends on how much momentum we can build around it, and the change will only happen if you actually start shifting your own mental model. So this, at least to me, and to Jerry, and the way we've talked about these principles, I actually often tell people that you are all CEOs. If for nothing, then you're CEOs of your own careers and your own future. You can actually apply these principles to shaping your own careers and your own your own trajectories. Um, that would be my biggest advice. Start with yourself. Start with your group. Start with your unit. Start with your your circles, and you will see that change can also be infectious. And I think, find inspiration wherever you can. I try to do that every day. I can find inspiration in a tennis match. I can find inspiration watching teenagers change the world. We can find inspiration in startups. I try to see as many startups as I can, because I think almost every startup CEO and the founding team, believe in what I call insurgent mindset. They believe they can change the world, otherwise they wouldn't start a business. And I
Sure.
think, how can we imbibe some of those principles in our day-to-day thinking? And that to me is the excitement of being in business.
That's right. And all change starts with you as an individual, and then you sort of expand it out, right? Okay, Nitin, thank you so much. Just a wonderful presentation. Your talk was very informative and very engaging. Thank you for sharing these, great nuggets of wisdom. And I'm sure our students and other participants found it very value adding. So, on behalf of the EMBA Consortium, my sincere thanks to you for taking out time to participate in this program.
Thank you guys for having me. Thank you, Mahesh, for the last 45 minutes, and I look forward to additional sessions with you guys in the future.
Thank you, sir. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.